We return to the distillery to find Doc, Dynapla, and Jade enjoying a friendly game of poker in the pub. Things are going pretty well. Most of the group get along quite well, with the exception of Fiorenza. But hopefully his incarceration does wonders for his likeability. Once he gets out, that is. Although they'd been getting by on wild heelroot in the area, it was finally time for Pinion to harvest their first field of cultivated heelroot. This would give them a lot better chances when it came to dealing with infections and injuries, which would prove especially useful given Thancuuara's tendency to contract anything possible. With the north, east and west sides defended by the palisades, Dynapla suggested that they erect some half-height barriers at the south of the village. These would allow the group to take cover while they return fire on any attackers. Doc was still visiting Fiorenza twice daily to try and convert him, but he wasn't the most socially adept, so his progress was slow. Utilising their stockpile of wood, the construction of the barriers was going quickly, so they added a few more to give them extra coverage. The pub's success was evident each night as those on the day shift mingled with those on the night shift, giving a wonderful example in miniature of Doc's perfect world of boozy harmony. Given that the group as a whole lacked mining skills, Doc felt it important for them to stockpile as much as they could when they had free time, even though they had no immediate need for it. As such, he set Thancuuara and Jade the task of extracting some from the nearby hills. With their food supplies running low and winter fast approaching, Dynapla set out to try and stockpile as much meat as he could, starting by hunting down a pack of wild boar which had wandered into the area. Having spent so long mining the steel in the hills, Thancuuara suggested that they mine the silver out of the meteors which had fallen in the village, giving them a chance to hone their skills whilst also providing some silver for trading. In an effort to make his hunts more efficient, Dynapla had taken to riding the horse out into the field, and using it to help haul back the heavy corpses. Although they had a long way to go in their quest to unite the world in their love of booze, Doc was extremely happy with the bustling little village they'd already created on the banks of the river. With an abundance of grapes to process and a lot of drive to start selling his wine, Doc insisted on adding additional fermenting barrels to the fermenting room. He also decided that it was clearly time to expand the hops farm. What he hadn't realised is that winter was fast approaching, so growing anything was about to become a near impossible task. Given that it had been a few days since Thancuuara had last contracted some illness, the universe decided it was clearly time that she experienced the joy of gutworms. At least now they had some herbal medicine stored that they could use to treat her. Doc had grand plans for his boozy empire, and one of those plans would eventually require chem fuel. He decided it would make sense to start stockpiling it now, so decided to plant a field of chemroot. Chemroot was a delicate plant which could only grow in fertile soil, and was at constant risk of becoming a massive fire hazard, if say a stray bolt of lightning or an angry raider decided to target it. As such, Doc decided to move the heelroot farm into the centre of the village, and repurpose that whole patch of fertile soil to be a chemroot farm. To create some slight safety around the site, he instructed the group to install a small fire break of stone blocks around the field, to hopefully stop the spread of fire if the field did happen to go up in flames. That night, Pinion was feeling a little tired, so decided to lie down for a quick nap right next to the archery targets. Doc saw this and thought it would be a wonderful time for him to partake in some target practice, the maniac. Although some of the group were still struggling a little with their moods, by and large they were a lot more happy thanks to all of Doc's additional amenities. So happy in fact that Pinion entered a learning frenzy, soaking up knowledge about all topics like a dry sponge. With Fiorenza now sequestered away in the makeshift prison, they had room to move Pinion out of the fermenting room and into a house of her own again. Doc acted like this was an act of kindness towards Pinion, but really it was to free up space in the fermenting room for more barrels. They would just need to take care to build a new house for Fiorenza ahead of his release. The good times just kept on rolling, and the good doctor himself suggested throwing a party in the pub to celebrate how far they had come. And what better way to celebrate their booze-making abilities than to spend an evening sampling their own goods. Sadly, as is so often the case, someone had to go too far. This time, it was Thancuuara who ended her night vomiting on the pub floor. Doc made a point of extending the path network within the village to ensure people had an easy path to access each of the areas of embrasures along the palisade walls. It wasn't long before their next challenge appeared. Another mechanoid cluster dropped into the area, this time in very close proximity to the village. Thankfully, they were dormant and didn't seem to be sensitive to either time nor proximity. Given the poor state of their equipment, Dynaplas suggested the best course of action currently would be to leave them alone and simply hope that nothing causes them to awaken. Despite not having yet completed the fire break, Doc and Pinion get to work planting the field of Kemru. With so much in one area, it gives off a dull, yellow glow, which hints at the danger it can pose. The stockpile in the centre of the village always had quite a limited space, due primarily to the limitations of where it was located. Eager to provide more storage in the centre of the area, so that they spent less time running around the village, Jade suggested an additional room attached to the distillery to act as a secondary storage area. Ignoring the angry smoke leaf addict in the room, Thancuuara was still utilising the makeshift prison for one of its other purposes, namely teaching Haxton about the world. Today's lesson? More information on how to beat someone to death, and, importantly, how to avoid being beaten to death. With their current research project approaching its end, Doc decided to build a prototype of a classic pub service for them to enjoy. A brand new dartboard. As winter begins to set in, the houses of the village are struggling to maintain their comfortable temperature against the cold outside. Thankfully, as they all have radiators, it's a simple matter of increasing the power to the boiler to bring them back up to temperature in minutes. With the cold weather and the abundance of furs they have from hunting, Jade suggests throwing down a proper tailoring bench so that she can create some proper cold weather clothing for them. It gets added to the production room of the distillery, as it already houses other production facilities as well as the ability to maintain a good working temperature. After checking in with the rest of the group, she makes a list of the items they'll need for the immediate future and gets to work. Fiorenza's conversion is going slow, but progress is being made. With this in mind, Doc starts planning out a new home for him, eager to make sure that once he rejoins the group, he's able to live happily. Given its proximity to the Kemroot field, they make sure to build out of stone. Given that there was more downtime now that the crops weren't growing, the group added a second research bench, to allow anyone with nothing else to do to contribute to the current research project. This increased speed meant it wasn't long before they were able to construct a prototype bin. Placing this in the pub would help keep it clean, despite the inevitable vomit and blood that would find its way onto the floors of the place. As this plan was made, Doc and Thancuuara finally decided to make things official and agreed to be in a relationship. They would now share Doc's house and bed, meaning that the new room they'd been building for Fiorenza was somewhat wasted, but hey, they would now have somewhere all ready to go for the next time someone else joined. Fiorenza was almost ready to convert, just as the house was finished, and it seemed like things would line up perfectly for his release. Sadly, he chose that moment to go berserk, meaning Doc had to beat him into submission once more, which was bound to put a bit of a dampener on the event. With the arrival of winter, all of the fields were marked for harvest, as the crops wouldn't survive the cold weather. This meant that for 1/4 of each year, they wouldn't be able to produce any new hops for beer. This was simply unacceptable to Doc, and he began working on a solution. Hydroponics and a sun lamp would require far more energy than they could safely produce at the moment, so, instead, he elected to build a greenhouse. This would be a part of the distillery, making the distillery a large compound, all with the intention to produce booze. He would add a heater, some grow beds full of soil, and some skylights to provide sunlight to their growing beds without letting out the precious heat. The beating he'd received had sent Fiorenza on a sad wander, further increasing the time it would take to convert and release him. Doc, on the other hand, seemed to have really enjoyed the beating, so much so that it caused him to enter a party frenzy. It's an odd reaction to have to beating your friend, but who are we to judge? With winter in full swing, food was becoming a bit of an issue. They'd already hunted most of the larger wildlife in the area, meaning that now they had to resort to small game, such as raccoons and guinea pigs. On the 6th of August, Fiorenza was finally converted and was immediately released back into the colony to be one of the team again. And, perhaps most importantly, without his old religion holding him back, He finally got to indulge in a bit of the smoke leaf that he'd been craving for so long. As the group were sleeping one night, a shower of incredibly valuable meteors hit the area, just outside the village. One was formed half of components and half of plasteel, and the other two were made of steel. These would likely prove very useful, although it may be a while before that time arrives. With the next batch of beer and wine ready, the shelves in the distillery's freezer are getting quite full, so the group finally decide to add the additional shelves that they can fit in now thanks to the extension. Determined to finally get his booze out there and start making a name for himself, as well as some allies, Doc instructs Dynapla to mount the horse, which he's renamed as Hershey Horse because he loves alliteration, and head out to the nearby settlement of Erershaw to offer them as gifts. Eager to see their plans come to fruition, the group all help load up Hershey Horse with the goods, and he and Dynapla head on their way. With food becoming an increasingly scarce resource, Jade suggests that they utilise one of their greatest advantages as a settlement, the river. She designates a number of spots along the riverbank where people can fish in order to help restock the pub's freezer. Naturally, with their lead security specialist Dynapla away on business, a raid of Neanderthals approaches the village. Neanderthals are very dangerous, as they're incredibly difficult to put down, feeling little pain and bashing in brains regardless of their own blood loss. This could be tricky. Pinion, Doc, Thancuuara and Jade all stack up on one of the barriers at the southeast of the village, looking to engage the smaller group that had arrived from the east first. Unfortunately, the other group of raiders arrived on the west side of the village at roughly the same time, mitigating the advantage the group had hoped to gain by thinning out the numbers of the group in the east. Doc managed to stun one just as they reached the barrier, allowing the rest of the team to pump bullets into them. Theoretically anyway, sadly their aim was quite poor so they didn't manage to inflict much damage. The second raider soon entered the fray and began engaging Jade in melee combat. Thankfully Jade excelled at melee combat, so she pulled out her mace and started swinging away. The raiders on the west side had entered the village and begun to set fire to the fields, but there was no one who could be spared to deal with that at the moment. Two of those raiders also began to move on the defensive position from the north, meaning they would soon be engaged by 4 combatants, so they were already struggling heavily against 2. Things weren't looking too good. The group tried to pull back whilst loosing shots at the raiders, however the 2 from the north intercepted the group and were able to knock down Jade. Thankfully at that moment, Thancuuara managed to get off an incredibly lucky shot, which instantly killed one of the raiders. They may not feel much pain, but they do still need a heart and a brain to function. Having knocked down Jade and taken a hell of a beating, one of the group of raiders decide they can leave happily, as long as they kidnap Jade on the way out. The group of course have no intention of letting them take Jade and rush back towards the fleeing raiders, looking to put them down before they can leave the area with her. They do still need to be tactical about their movements though, as some of the raiders are still out for blood. They manage to incapacitate the raider who was carrying Jade and begin to beat a retreat, hoping to injure the 2 fresh and uninjured raiders who just joined the fight. Most of Jade's wounds were blunt force, meaning that she wasn't bleeding out at any great rate and was able to get herself back up once the raider who was carrying her had gone down. She used this opportunity to beat a hasty retreat back into the village. Thancuuara, Doc and Pinion tried their best to kite one of the aggressive raiders back, but Thancuuara's injury slowed her down to the point where the raider managed to land a number of devastating hits on her. Doc was eventually able to land a stun on the attacker, allowing them to get to a safe distance. There was another issue however. Jade was being chased by 2 of the other raiders and was close to dropping due to blood loss by this point. One of the other members of the group would have to try and get past their current attacker to intervene and help Jade. Doc managed to squeeze past the attacker and started heading towards Jade's position, however the attacker turned and began to follow him. Pinion and Thancuuara continued to pepper the attacker with bullets, hoping to draw his attention or, better yet, put him down for good. This ploy turned out to be successful as the attacker turned to fight Pinion and Thancuuara. Unfortunately, Thancuuara got too close and, following another hit from the attacker, her injuries became too much to handle and she hit the ground. Jade had also hit the ground again, and another of the raiders was attempting to carry her away once more, while the other attacker charged Doc, stopping him from interfering. Thankfully Doc managed to land a stun on his attacker and made his way past them towards the raider who was kidnapping Jade. Still only having a taser as his weapon, Doc decided to beat the raider with his fists as they tried to run. The whole place was still carnage, but with their attacker finally fleeing, Pinion decided to run and tend to Thancuuara, only to find that, along with many other wounds, she had lost both of her eyes to the raider's blade. As the remaining raiders fled, Doc continued to beat on the fleeing raider who was carrying Jade. It took a while, but he was eventually able to get the raider to drop Jade, and he immediately began tending to her wounds. With the enemy routed and Jade and Thancuuara's wounds receiving the treatment they needed, Doc set his sights on the last raider, who had gotten stuck inside of their walls while trying to flee. Having seen what they'd done to his partner Thancuuara, however, he had no mercy. And with that, their deadliest raid so far was over. Doc was worried about Thancuuara, however. Back on the hospital, it would have been a simple matter to install a couple of bionic eyes for her, but down here, such things would likely be few and far between. He would need to keep a careful watch for any opportunity to obtain them, so that he could restore sight to his partner. Jade had also lost an arm during the fight, making carrying out many of her tasks a much slower process than previously. But she had survived. Escaping that chaos with just a missing arm seemed like a victory. Doc promised he would try and find her a replacement too, as soon as he could. The graveyard grew in size once more, looking all the more forlorn for the layer of snow which had begun to fall during the fight and had already uncovered the entire landscape in a chill blanket. It wasn't long before Jade was struck down with an infection as a result of one of her injuries. She'd been through plenty and had fought fiercely to defend her friends, so Doc was content for her to take some bed rest until she'd recovered from the infection. Finally arriving at Erishaw, Dynapla made quick work of presenting his gifts of beer and wine, and he received the expected thanks in return. A few more exchanges like that, and Erishaw would begin to welcome the sight of Doc's people. His mission complete, he packed up Hershey Horse once more and they set off back towards the village, having no idea of the horrific events that had happened that night. That evening, Fiorenza broke down and hid in his room. He must have had a really rough time last night, hiding in his bedroom while his friends were all getting hurt and traumatised. I can see why some of the village don't like him very much. Dynapla returned late that evening. Although Erishaw wasn't far from the village, it had been a remarkably slow journey. But this just increased Doc's resolve to see his new plan for distribution come to fruition. When Dynapla returned to see the additional graves in the graveyard, he immediately got to work planning out some more to go along with them. Doc had told him how gruesome the attack had been, but Dynapla was under no illusions that it would be the last or even the worst. Later that day, things had calmed down a little. A new research project had been started, microelectronics. Pinion was in the field harvesting some hops, and Doc and Thancuuara were out on a little date to try and cheer her up. So naturally another incident occurred, as yet another mechanoid cluster dropped into the area. Thankfully this one landed on the north side of the base, meaning there was little reason for any of the group to be out there and risk activating it. With another batch of excellent wine produced, they were starting to create quite a supply. Now they just needed an effective means of distributing it. Given the slow growth rate of Chemroot and its penchant for blowing up at the slightest inconvenience, Dynapla suggested that they invest in an alternate method of chem fuel production which Doc hadn't been aware of: boomalopes. Dynapla was convinced that he could tame some of the boomalopes in the area and milk them for their chem fuel. Doc was happy to let them try, so instructed the group to place down a second, larger animal pen in the northwest corner of the village. With winter coming to an end, the group started replanting the fields, in anticipation of the growing season arriving soon. Pinion took the opportunity to suggest that they add a field of corn. Corn grew slow but had a large yield, meaning that they might only harvest the field once before next winter, but it could produce enough to see them through the whole of winter, without them having to scrape and scavenge for fish and animals. In his new role as Chief Security Officer, Dynapla liked to keep an eye on all the potentially dangerous animals in the area, and he spotted that a wild warg had entered the village. Although it didn't currently pose a threat to them, he wanted to deal with the issue before the warg got hungry. Now that they had had a few days to recover from the attack, Dynapla insisted that they add an additional wall to the south. The group had told him about the attack, and he really didn't want any future attacks to have the opportunity to get behind their defences like the last one. He intended this wall to funnel any attacks through a single choke point, and he chose this particular location as it would force attackers to wade through the river, slowing them down. With their new defences planned, everyone felt a little more secure and got back to living their lives, hanging out and enjoying each other's company in the pub. The next step in this madness would be a rush to research the distribution methods, so that they could win over the hearts and minds of the raiders before they could launch an even more deadly attack. Hey guys, Tuna here. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode, and apologies again that it was a bit late. Life's been just incredibly busy lately, as it tends to be around this time of year. But I am actually trying out a new working pattern at the moment, which I hope will give me more time in any given week to focus on making YouTube stories for you all. So fingers crossed that works out. Other than that, I hope everyone has an absolutely wonderful week coming up, and I will see you again next week for the next chapter in Dr. and King's story.